The hegemony ship's sovereign clarity hung over the ruins of Tulsa like a cathedral, built for a god who had never once doubted himself. It was 3 kilometers long, black as a burial shroud, and it cast a shadow across 14 city blocks that never quite shifted no matter how the sun moved. The Veth had chosen the placement deliberately. The Veth did most things deliberately. They were a species that had been spacefaring for 11,000 years, that had colonized 47 systems, that had reduced 6 sentient species to client cultures before humanity had learned to write. They did not make impulsive decisions. They did not make errors. And they had absolutely no concept, genetic or cultural, of the particular human quality that their xenolinguists had eventually classified, after 6 years of study, as stubbornness. Corporal Ray's Akafra Malone had been sitting in what used to be the lobby of the First National Bank of Tulsa for 11 days now. He hadn't meant to sit here for 11 days. He had meant to sit here for maybe 4 hours, until the patrol route cycled past and he could slip back through the drainage tunnels to the resistance camp under the old stockyards. That had been 11 days ago. The patrol route had not cycled past. The patrol route had, inexplicably, stopped. The Veth had stationed a permanent post at the intersection of 5th and Boston, 2 men, 2 Veth, and a scanning array that would light him up like a firework. The second, he crossed the open ground between the bank and the drainage grate. So Ray sat. He sat in an overturned leather chair that had once belonged to some vice president of something, surrounded by smashed marble and the skeletal remains of what had been, 3 years ago, a very handsome fern. He sat with his rifle across his knees. He had 11 rounds left. He had 2 protein bars, both of which he had rationed so carefully that he was now eating approximately 1/5 of a protein bar per day. And he had a half-liter of water that he refilled from a burst pipe in the basement every morning. He had a paperback copy of a novel he'd already read 4 times, a battered western about a man who kept getting run out of towns he loved. And he had the particular mental furniture of a man who had grown up very poor in a very small house with 5 siblings, and had therefore developed, young, the ability to occupy almost no space at all and to wait. He was good at waiting. The Veth, it turned out, were not particularly good at watching. This was the thing nobody had understood about them, early on. The Veth had sensors that could detect a rabbit from low orbit. They had scanning arrays that read thermal, chemical, electromagnetic, and a 4th category of signal that human science still didn't have a word for. But watching, the patient, attention-paying, eyes-on-the-dark act of watching that humans did when they were afraid, that the Veth had never needed to develop. Nothing had ever frightened them. Nothing had ever stalked them in the dark. They had been the apex predator on their homeworld and the apex civilization in their corner of the galaxy, and they scanned rather than watched, and scanning required the thing to be moving, to be pinging, to be doing something worth cataloging. Ray's was not doing anything worth cataloging. Ray's was sitting very still in a smashed bank lobby, breathing slowly, eating 1/5 of a protein bar, rereading a Western novel about a stubborn man, and waiting. On the morning of the 12th day, the situation changed. He heard them first, the low-frequency harmonic that preceded Veth ground movement, that bone-deep hum that the resistance had learned to associate with bad news. He pressed himself flat against the overturned chair and watched through a crack in the shattered front windows as 3 Veth ground vehicles rolled past, followed by something he had never seen before. It was a palanquin. That was the word that came to him. A palanquin. The kind of thing carried by servants in old historical photographs, except this one moved under its own power on a cushion of magnetic repulsion, and was made of some material that seemed to shift between gray and gold depending on the angle of light. And it was enormous, large enough to carry a throne, which it did, because the top was open to the sky, and sitting on the throne was a Veth that Ray's, even at this distance and through this crack, recognized immediately. Veth second-born of the 11th descent, called in the Resistance's intelligence briefs simply the Chancellor, the being who had authorized the orbital bombardment of Chicago, the being who had signed the capitulation accords that had stripped the last 23 human governments of their sovereignty and reorganized Earth's remaining population into labor designations, the being who had, on 2 separate occasions, been filmed on Veth propaganda broadcasts explaining, in the patient tone of a teacher addressing a slow student, why humanity's continued existence was a conditional privilege rather than an inherent right. The Chancellor was coming to the old Sovereign Bank building, which meant, Reyes realized with a sinking clarity, that there was something in this building that the Chancellor wanted. He had been sleeping near it for 11 days. He spent the next 40 minutes in complete silence, not moving, barely breathing, listening to the convoy establish a perimeter outside. He counted footsteps. He counted the particular clatter of Veth scanning equipment being deployed. He counted, carefully, the silences between sounds, and he built in his head a map of where the bodies were, and where the gaps between the bodies were, and he thought about the thing in the basement that he had been carefully not thinking about for 11 days because thinking about it felt too large, too strange, too much like hope, and hope in Reyes' experience was the thing that got you killed. But he thought about it now. 3 days into his involuntary stay at the First National Bank, he had been refilling his water bottle from the burst pipe when his flashlight had caught something wrong in the wall. Not wrong exactly. Deliberate. Someone had broken through the original plaster and exposed a section of a much older wall beneath, pre-building, possibly pre-street grid, and in that older wall, mortared with care into what looked like river stone, was a door. Not a human door. He had known that immediately, the same way you knew immediately when something had not been made for your hands. The proportions were slightly off. The handle, if it was a handle, was placed where a handle would be if the person reaching for it had a slightly longer arm and a slightly different shoulder joint. The material was the same shifting gray gold as the Chancellor's palanquin, and the door had no lock that he could see, only a seat, a broad, low seat, built into the wall beside the door, as if whatever was behind it required you to sit before you could open it. He had not sat in it. He had stood in the basement with his flashlight for a long time, and then he had gone back upstairs and eaten a fifth of a protein bar and read his Western novel, and told himself the seat was probably a trap, a piece of alien tech he didn't understand, something that would vaporize him or signal the palanquin or do something else terrible and alien and beyond his ability to anticipate. He had told himself this for 11 days. He heard the Chancellor's retinue entering the bank above him. He heard and felt, in his sternum, the low harmonic of multiple scanning arrays going active. In approximately 4 minutes they would sweep the basement. In approximately 4 minutes and 30 seconds they would find him. Reyes went down the basement stairs. He stood in front of the seat for 15 seconds. He sat down. Nothing happened for a moment, then everything did. The seat recognized him. That was the only way to describe it. It recognized him, not as a specific person but as a specific kind of thing. There was a sensation in his spine, not painful, more like the feeling of a key turning in a lock that you'd forgotten was there. The door beside him clicked open, and the shifting gray-gold material rippled once, like a curtain in a wind, and behind it was a room that should not have fit inside the bank's basement. It was a throne room. Or it had been once. Ray stood in the doorway and stared, and the room stared back, vast and dark and patient, the ceiling somewhere up above the reach of his flashlight, and the walls lined with the same river stone construction as the outer wall but carved now with shapes he couldn't fully parse, not quite writing, not quite decoration, something in between, the visual record of something important. At the center of the room, on a raised dais of the gray-gold material, was a throne. It was not the Chancellor's throne. The Chancellor's throne was up on the palanquin, ornate and massive and clearly designed to communicate dominance to any species with eyes. This throne was different. This throne was built for a human. He could tell because the proportions were right, exactly right, with a strange intimacy, as if someone had measured him specifically, and because the material of it was warm to the air in a way that no stone should be, and because when he crossed the room and put his hand on the armrest he felt, again, that sense of recognition, that key-in-a-lock sensation, stronger now, like a door opening inside him rather than in the wall. He heard boots on the stairs above, multiple sets. They had found the stairway to the basement. Ray sat down on the throne. The room woke up. Later, much later, when the historians and the xenoarchaeologists and the linguists got their hands on the site and spent 6 years arguing about it, the best reconstruction would suggest that the room had been dormant for approximately 11,000 years, sealed and waiting for a specific biological key that only became available when a new spacefaring species reached the threshold of the hegemony's territory. The builders, whoever they were, had apparently known the Veth well enough to bury their gifts for the civilizations that would come after, and had built the lock precisely to exclude Veth biology, to exclude the particular biochemical signature of a species that had never needed to be afraid, that had evolved without the neurotransmitter cascade associated with prolonged stress, with waiting, with the long patient endurance of being small in a vast universe. The lock was not for the Veth. The lock was for something the Veth had always needed to eventually meet, something that could sit still in the dark for 12 days on a fifth of a protein bar and a Western novel and wait. What happened in the 40 seconds after Reyes sat down was later described by the 3 Veth soldiers who had reached the basement doorway as, according to the translation, the event horizon of our understanding. One of them would spend the rest of his career studying what he had seen. The other 2 would not speak of it for years. The Chancellor, arriving behind them at a run, the first time any Veth had been documented running toward something rather than away from it in 11,000 years of recorded history, pressed himself against the doorframe and looked at the human sitting on a throne in a room that was now blazing with the gray-gold light of activated systems. And what passed across the Chancellor's face was not fear exactly, because the Veth did not have fear, but something that the xenolinguists later translated carefully as the recognition of a category error. The Chancellor had been wrong about something fundamental. The room was telling him so. Reyes did not know any of this yet. What Reyes knew was that the throne felt like coming home, which made no sense, and that things were happening around him that he couldn't fully see or process, and that he was very tired and very hungry, and that his hands were shaking, and he didn't know if it was fear or the protein bar malnutrition, or the low electrical hum that was moving through the throne and through him and into the floor in waves. And he thought about his mother, which he often did when things were happening that he didn't understand. Because his mother had been a woman who understood very little about the large forces moving through the world, but who had always known exactly what to do with her hands. She had been a nurse, a good one. She had worked 2 jobs and raised 3 kids in a city that didn't make it easy, and she had done it not through any large dramatic act of will, but through the patient, daily, unspectacular accumulation of small necessary things. The bandage applied, the meal made, the story read, the hand held in the dark. She had told him once when he was 7 and scared of something he couldn't name, that the trick was not to fight what was big and dark and coming for you, but to make yourself useful to it. Find the thing it needs, she had said, and give it. He didn't know why he was thinking about this. He didn't know why the throne had lit up. He didn't know what the light was for, or the hum, or the carved walls that were now doing something that his brain kept trying to classify as reading, even though they were made of stone. He didn't know what he had activated or what would happen next. But his hands had stopped shaking. The Chancellor spoke from the doorway. Reyes didn't understand the words. His Veth was bad, field manual bad, enough to follow basic commands and not much else. But the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone you used when something had done something you needed to understand before you could respond to it. the tone of a question that didn't know yet if it was afraid of the answer. Reyes looked up at him. "Hey," he said. The Chancellor said something else. One of the soldiers behind him raised a weapon. "I wouldn't," Reyes said, not because he knew something, he didn't know much. But the room was still humming, and the gray-gold light was still spreading, and the things carved into the walls were still doing the thing his brain kept calling reading. And he had a feeling, not certainty. Just the feeling you got when you were sitting in the right place at the right time, and the universe was briefly organized in your favor. That the throne had not activated 11,000 years' worth of dormant alien systems, just to have the person sitting in it shot immediately. The Chancellor made a gesture. The soldier lowered the weapon. They looked at each other. The Veth Chancellor, who had been running an occupied Earth for 3 years, and the half-starved human corporal with a paperback Western in his back pocket and 11 rounds in his rifle. And the room hummed around them, and the walls read themselves, and the gray-gold light filled the space between them like something trying to be translated. "What is this place?" the Chancellor said in English, accented but clear. Most high-ranking Veth spoke English. It was the language of the species they were currently administering. Reyes looked around at the room he had activated. "I don't know," he said. "You activated it." I sat down. Many beings have sat in that seat over 11,000 years. None of them activated it. Reyes thought about this. The seat outside, in the basement. "This has been a hegemony archaeological site for 40 years, the Chancellor said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger and not quite its opposite. 40 years of study. We knew the door existed. We knew the throne room existed behind sealed stone. We could not open the door. And I opened it by sitting in the chair." "By sitting in the chair," the Chancellor paused. "You were not attempting to open it." "I was hiding from your soldiers," Reyes said. "I've been hiding in the bank for 12 days. The silence that followed this was interesting. Reyes watched the Chancellor's face and tried to read it the way you read a face when you didn't share a common emotional vocabulary, looking for the things that crossed species, the slight widening or narrowing of whatever served as eyes, the change in the set of the shoulders, the quality of the breathing. The Chancellor was very still, very controlled, but something had shifted. 12 days, the Chancellor said. 11 actually. I just started saying 12. Why? It felt longer. The Chancellor moved into the room then, slowly, and Reyes stayed in the throne because he wasn't sure what happened if he got up, and he wasn't sure he could stand anyway. And because the throne was doing something to him that he kept trying to identify and couldn't, something that wasn't quite reading his mind but was more like cataloging him, filing him, recognizing in him a long series of things that matched a long series of criteria in a list that had been made a very long time ago by someone who had known what to look for. The Chancellor walked a slow circuit of the throne room, looking at the walls. His retinue stayed in the doorway. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been surprised by something and was not going to show it, and Reyes watched him and thought about his mother and waited. "These inscriptions," the Chancellor said finally from the far side of the room, "we have never been able to read them. Our most sophisticated translation matrices have produced nothing." "They're reading now," Reyes said. The Chancellor turned. "What do you see?" "I don't know, not exactly. It's not that I can read them. It's more like I understand what they're about, the general shape of it." He paused, trying to find the words for something that wasn't quite happening in the part of his brain that dealt with language. "It's about waiting," he said. "The whole room is about waiting. About not fighting something big, but making yourself necessary to it." The Chancellor was very still. "And about what happens," Reyes continued, because the throne was still humming and he was still being catalogued, and the words kept coming up from somewhere below language. "To a civilization that has spent so long winning every fight that it doesn't know anymore what a fair one looks like. about what it can't see because it's never had to look. He didn't know how he knew this. He knew it the way you knew what a song was about before you could name it, felt it in the structure, in the space between the carved lines, in the low gray-gold light that was coming from the walls now, warm and steady, the light of something that had been waiting a very long time to be understood. "Who built this?" the Chancellor said very quietly. "I don't know their name," Reyes said. "Something the inscription keeps calling the ones who came before the hegemony, the ones the hegemony replaced." He paused. "The last ones you administered before us." The Chancellor made a sound that Reyes couldn't categorize. "They left this for the next one," Reyes said. "The next species you found. They knew you'd come for us the same way you came for them. They knew the door wouldn't open for you." He looked around at the warm, glowing walls of the room, at the 11,000 years of stored waiting, all the patient knowledge of a species that had known what it was like to be small and found and taken. "They built it so only we could open it." "Why?" the Chancellor said. "What is the purpose of the room?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. The hum of the throne moved through him, steady and low, and the cataloging feeling deepened, and more of the room resolved into sense, into the general shape of meaning. "It's a key," he said. "To what?" "To your ships," Reyes said. "To every Veth military vessel built in the last 4,000 years. The people who built this room reverse-engineered your propulsion systems about 8,000 years ago. They were very patient about it." He looked at the Chancellor. "The throne can broadcast a signal to every Veth vessel within range of this system, a command code. The previous civilization didn't have anyone to sit in the throne and broadcast it." He paused. "We do." The silence in the room was absolute. The Chancellor stood completely still, and Reyes sat in the throne, and the gray-gold light held them both inside it, and the walls read themselves, and the carved shapes moved through 11,000 years of stored patience and arrived at this moment, this specific moment, this human in this chair in this room that had been waiting for exactly this. "You would disable our fleet," the Chancellor said. "Not a question, not quite." "I could," Reyes said. "The throne says I could. The signal would cascade through every ship in orbit, every ship in system. You'd lose navigation, weapons, containment for the drive cores." He met the Chancellor's eyes. "You'd have about 37 minutes before the drives overloaded." "Then why," the Chancellor said slowly, "are you still sitting there?" Reyes looked at him for a long moment. He thought about his mother. He thought about the Western novel in his back pocket, and the 5 siblings in the small house, and the burst pipe in the basement, and the protein bars, and the 11 days in the smashed bank lobby, and all the things that had brought him to this room, this throne, this moment. "Because I'm not actually sure that's the right move," he said. The Chancellor blinked. It was the first uncontrolled movement Reyes had seen from him. 37 minutes and your whole fleet is gone," Reyes said. "And then what? We're still on an occupied planet. You have ground forces, ground infrastructure, command hierarchies that don't depend on the fleet. We'd take out your ships and you'd spend a year burning down every city on Earth in retaliation before help could reach us." He shook his head. "The people who built this room were smart. They didn't build it as a weapon. They built it as a bargaining chip. There's a difference." "You are," the Chancellor said, and the pause before the next word was so long that Reyes thought he might not finish the sentence. "Negotiating." "I'm sitting in a throne that can crash your entire fleet and having a conversation with you instead," Reyes said. "Yeah, I'm negotiating." He adjusted his weight in the chair, which was, now that he thought about it, extraordinarily comfortable. "My side would probably prefer I just hit the button. They're going to be very upset with me when this gets out." He paused. "You should know that. There are people in the resistance who will argue this is the worst decision in human history. You should factor that into whatever calculation you're making right now." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my mother was a nurse," Reyes said, "and she taught me that you don't build trust by hiding your disadvantages. You build it by showing them to the other person before they find them on their own. The Chancellor was silent for a very long time. Outside, Reyes could feel, through the hum of the throne, the Veth retinue in the doorway, the scanning arrays that had gone haywire the moment the room activated, the distant harmonic of the ship 3 kilometers up in the Tulsa sky. He could feel all of it. The throne was still cataloging him, still reading him, and he was beginning to understand that what it was reading was not his capabilities or his intentions, but something else, something the builders of this room had been very specific about, something that could not be faked or borrowed or approximated by a species that had spent 11,000 years never needing to be afraid. It was reading his capacity for restraint. It was reading the specific quality of choosing not to use the thing you had in your hands, when using it would be easier than not using it. The Chancellor walked back across the room and stopped 3 feet from the throne and looked at Reyes Akaffer Malone, corporal, resistance fighter, man who had eaten a fifth of a protein bar a day for 11 days, and said, in a voice that had something in it that Reyes did not have a word for, and that the xenolinguists would later spend years debating, "What are your terms?" And Reyes thought for a moment about all the things you said to someone who had 3 years of occupation behind them and an orbital fleet above you, and he thought about his mother, who had worked 2 jobs and never once asked for more than what she needed, and he said, "Start with the labor designations. Those go first, and then we talk about the cities." The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours. In that 6 hours, the Veth retinue in the doorway did not move. The scanning arrays continued to produce nonsense. The ship above Tulsa held its position. The resistance, back at the stockyard camp, sent out 4 search parties for Reyes and found nothing and reported him missing and presumed dead, which he would feel terrible about later. At some point, one of the soldiers passed in a ration bar from Veth supplies, which Reyes ate in its entirety in approximately 45 seconds. And the Chancellor watched him do this with an expression that Reyes could not read, and that the historians would later describe, conservatively, as the first recorded instance of Veth awkwardness. At hour 3, the Chancellor asked him how he had survived in the bank for 11 days without being detected. "I was very still," Reyes said. "Our sensors should have found you. They were looking for something moving. I wasn't moving much. Humans require movement, activity, stimulation." The Chancellor said this with the confidence of someone citing field research. "Our xenolinguists' profiles indicate." "Your xenolinguists have been studying us for 3 years, Reyes said. "That's not very long. It is sufficient to understand a species." "With respect," Reyes said, "I don't think you understand us at all." The Chancellor tilted his head. "Explain." Reyes thought about this for a moment. The throne hummed under him. The walls glowed warm. "You came here expecting to administer a species," he said. "You'd done it 6 times before. You have a framework, a methodology. You knew what worked. And you looked at us and you saw the things your framework was built to see: the violence, the chaos, the political fragmentation, the environmental destruction. You saw a species that couldn't organize itself, that was constantly at war with itself." He paused. "And all of that was true. It's still true. I'm not arguing with the data." "Then what?" "The data missed the other thing," Reyes said. "It missed what we're like when we don't have a choice, when the thing we're up against is too big to fight directly and too important to walk away from." He gestured at the room around them, the stored patience in the walls, the 11,000 years of someone else's knowing. "You administered 6 species. All of them either fought you or they folded. The ones that fought you, you defeated. The ones that folded, you administered." He met the Chancellor's eyes. "Nobody sat in a smashed bank lobby for 11 days, eating 1/5 of a protein bar and waited." The Chancellor was quiet. "Nobody built a room like this and buried it and waited for a species with the specific neurochemistry of prolonged stress to come along and open the door," Reyes continued. "Because the last species you found before us, they waited. They were patient. They didn't fight you and they didn't fold. They did the third thing, and you didn't see it coming, and now they're gone and they left us their homework. He looked at the Chancellor, who was looking at him with an expression that was doing something complicated. I think, the Chancellor said finally, that your species has been significantly underestimated. I think, Reyes said, that you should probably factor that into the negotiation. At hour 5, they agreed on the framework. Not a treaty. Both of them were clear it wasn't a treaty yet, but a framework for a process that would produce a treaty, which was different and also, Reyes had argued, more durable, because a framework that both sides had built was harder to walk away from than a document that one side had dictated to the other. The labor designations would be dissolved within 90 days. The orbital fleet would move to a non-occupation posture, still present, but no longer in bombardment range of major population centers. A joint body would be established, with human and Veth representatives, to oversee the transition. In exchange, and this was the part of the negotiation that Reyes had spent the most time on, that had consumed 2 of the 6 hours that he had approached and retreated from and approached again, the throne stayed sealed. The command code stayed dormant. The signal stayed unsent. He had not consulted anyone about this. He would later be very loudly second-guessed about it by every faction of the resistance and by several governments in exile, and by at least 2 academics who wrote books specifically about this choice. The argument against it was obvious. You don't surrender a weapon for a promise. The argument for it was harder to articulate, which was maybe why it hadn't been made very often in human history, but Reyes kept coming back to what the room had told him, what the builders had built into it, the thing the throne had been cataloging in him for 6 hours, which was that the difference between a negotiated peace and a victorious destruction was not just the number of casualties in the short term, but the shape of everything that came after. He had thought about his mother again, about the 2 jobs and the 3 kids and the bandages applied, and the meals made and the stories read and the hands held in the dark. She had never once tried to win a fight with the hospital administration or the landlord or the city by destroying them. She had always found the thing they needed and found a way to give it to them while also getting what she needed. And it had been slow and it had been hard, and it had occasionally been humiliating, and it had worked, because she was still there and so were her kids, and Reyes was alive and sitting in a throne in a secret room and negotiating the terms of humanity's liberation, which he suspected she would have opinions about. He was going to call her when this was over, he decided. If calling was still a thing that worked, he was pretty sure the communications infrastructure was still at least partially operational in Tulsa. At hour 6, the Chancellor stood and looked at him for a long moment without speaking, and then said something in Veth, very quietly, that no one else in the room could hear. Reyes's Veth was field manual bad, but he caught the word. He had seen it in the Resistance's intelligence glossaries once, a word the Veth used infrequently and only in specific contexts, a word that his glossary had translated inadequately as worthy of continuation. He didn't say anything, he nodded. The Chancellor left the room. Reyes sat in the throne for another 20 minutes after the retinue had gone, in the warm gray-gold light of the activated room, in the hum of 11,000 years of patience, and he thought about all the people who had built this place, who had sat in whatever their equivalent of a smashed bank lobby was, and waited and known that the door they were leaving behind would be opened by something they would never meet, something that would come later. Something that would be small and frightened and stubborn, and capable of sitting still in the dark for 12 days on a fifth of a protein bar and find at the end of it a throne. He wondered if they had been scared. He thought probably yes. He thought fear was maybe part of the mechanism, not the running kind, not the freezing kind, but the kind that lived in the body as a low, steady hum, the kind that made you careful, that made you patient, that made you notice the things a species without fear would never think to look for. The room hummed around him, warm and waiting, full of the specific knowledge of people who had known what it felt like to be found and taken, and to keep going anyway, who had built into the lock of their gift the one biological signature they were certain the taker would never have. Reyes got up from the throne. His legs ached, his back ached, he was still hungry. He had 11 rounds in his rifle and a Western novel in his pocket, and about 3 hours before the resistance figured out he was alive and came for him, and he was going to need to explain, somehow, what he had agreed to. And there were going to be people, good people, people who had lost things, people who had earned the right to want destruction, who were never going to forgive him for it. He stood in the doorway between the throne room and the bank's broken basement and looked back at the activated room, still glowing, still warm, the walls still reading themselves in the patient language of the dead, and he said, quietly, to no one and to everyone who had ever sat in the dark and waited, "I know. I'm sorry it took us so long." He went back up the stairs. Outside, the sovereign clarity was still hanging over the ruins of Tulsa like a cathedral, built for a god who had today been surprised by something. The patrol at 5th and Boston was gone. Reyes walked out through the front door of the First National Bank of Tulsa into the thin October sunlight, and he kept his hands visible because old habits were hard to break. And he walked south toward the stockyards and thought about his mother, and thought about what you said to someone who had been waiting for you, and had given up hoping you were alive. And he decided the answer was probably nothing complicated. You just showed up. The hegemony's formal withdrawal from Earth's orbital positions began 68 days after that morning, 2 days ahead of the agreed schedule. The Chancellor, in the official statement broadcast on Veth Communications networks, said that the terms had been favorable to both parties. He did not elaborate. The room beneath the First National Bank of Tulsa was sealed again after the xenoarchaeologists finished their work, by mutual agreement, with a human representative and a Veth representative both present for the ceremony. The seat in the outer room, the low seat built for a specific kind of waiting, was left accessible. The resistance asked for it to be placed under a monument. The Chancellor's office sent a message, through channels, suggesting it be left exactly where it was. It was left exactly where it was. It sat in a basement in Tulsa next to a burst pipe, with no monument, in the dark, waiting the way it had always waited, for whatever came next. On the day the last Veth ground vehicle crossed the perimeter of what had been the occupation zone, Reyes was at his mother's kitchen table in Memphis, eating the first full meal he'd had in 3 years. She had made egusi soup, which was his favorite, and she sat across from him and watched him eat and didn't say anything for a long time, and then she said, "You look terrible." "I know," he said. "You've lost weight." "I know." "Were you eating?" "A fifth of a protein bar a day," he said. She looked at him, "A fifth?" "It's a long story." She poured him more soup. "You should have called." The communications infrastructure was. "You should have called," she said again, the same way she had said things when he was 7 years old and scared of something he couldn't name, with the particular certainty of someone who understood that most problems were smaller than they looked from the inside and larger than they looked from the outside, and that the answer to both was the same. Pay attention, stay useful, hold on. "Yeah," he said, "I know." He ate his soup. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was the particular blue of October in Memphis, clear and ordinary and enormous, and somewhere far above it the Veth fleet was repositioning itself along the vectors agreed upon in a 6-hour conversation in a throne room that 11,000 years of patience had built for exactly this. For this ordinary sky, this soup, this kitchen table, this moment when the long wait ended and the thing you'd been holding on for turned out to be real. He finished the soup. His mother washed the bowl. He thought about calling the resistance to debrief. He thought about the historians who would want to talk to him. He thought about the academics and the second-guessers and the people who were never going to forgive him. And he thought about the Chancellor's quiet word, the word that meant worthy of continuation, and he thought about the room still glowing in the Tulsa dark, and all the people who had built it, and all the years they had waited, and all the specific patience they had poured into a lock that only opened for something that knew how to sit still. He thought, we got here. He thought, my mother taught me how. He went to bed. Outside, the sky was ordinary and enormous and full of stars, and far away in the dark between them, something was moving toward the edges of the hegemony's territory. Something young and small and not yet known, and the room in Tulsa was waiting, warm and patient, with its seat beside a burst pipe and its throne in the dark, because it had been built to last, and what it had been built for was not yet finished. It was only just beginning.